I no longer feel guilty about stretching my legs out in a chair in the middle of the day. 73 is old enough to afford that luxury. When I was young, it seemed almost a crime to sit idle. Now I enjoy the quiet of my home in Flower Mound every morning, sipping mint tea and watching the sun creep slowly across the wooden floor of my living room. Retirement caught up with me 3 years ago. Harlow and Associates, where I'd worked as an accountant for nearly 4 decades, threw a modest dinner in my honor. Mr. Harlow, a gray-haired but still energetic man, handed me a silver watch and an envelope with a check that was generous enough to allow me to finally repair my porch. Colleagues spoke warm words. I smiled and thanked, but a strange feeling of emptiness lived inside me. My life had revolved around others for too long. First, around Edgar, my ex-husband, handsome and useless as a pedigreed cat. Then around Lawrence, my son, who is long grown and living his life 20 minutes away, but only calls on holidays. Finally, around work, columns of numbers that I checked with manic precision, as if something more than Harlow and Associates' profits depended on it. Now I'm just Hilda Ansley, an elderly woman with arthritis that bothers me on rainy days, with a house that's too big for one, and with a sudden freedom I don't know how to use. At first, I tried to fill my days with the usual chores: cleaning, cooking, reading, late-night TV shows. Then I enrolled in a computer course at the local library. She mastered the internet to the point where she could spend hours reading articles about gardening and watching videos about traveling to countries she'd never been to. One Saturday, when the spring sun was particularly bright, I decided to dismantle the garage. Among the boxes of old Lawrence toys, Christmas ornaments, and long unused kitchen appliances, I came across a dusty photo album. The pictures show a younger version of me, with long brown hair and wearing dresses that now seem ridiculously short. A tall young man with kind eyes and a wide smile often appears next to me. Abraham Pettigrew. "My God, Abraham," I whispered, running my fingers over the yellowed photograph. We'd been friends since before I'd met Edgar. Abraham was quiet, reliable, always willing to help. He made plans, dreamed of starting his own business, and I chose Edgar with his deceptive charm and empty promises. When Edgar left, leaving me with 5-year-old Lawrence, Abraham was the only one who offered real help, not empty condolences. But I was too proud and too immersed in my pain. I pushed him away, telling him I could handle it on my own. And indeed I did. But at what cost? I closed the album and went back to sorting things out. That night before bed, however, I Googled Abraham's name for the first time in years. It turned out that not only had he realized his dream of owning his own business, but he had turned a small construction company into a respectable firm. I didn't bother trying to contact him. Too much time had passed, and what would I say? "Hey, remember me? The girl who chose someone else over you and then rejected your help?" Fate, however, decreed otherwise. 2 weeks after my archaeological expedition to the garage, I ran into Abraham at the supermarket, literally bumped our carts, met on a curve between the shelves of canned goods and pasta. "Excuse me," I began, raising my eyes to the tall, gray-haired man. Time had not spared him as much as it had me. Wrinkles furrowed his once smooth face, his back a little hunched. But his eyes, the same kind eyes the color of bitter chocolate, looked at me with recognition and wonder. "Hilda?" His voice had deepened, but it still had the soft notes I remembered. "Abraham," I breathed out. What a reunion! We stood blocking the aisle until a disgruntled woman with a child asked us to move. That diffused the awkwardness of the moment. We both laughed and agreed to have coffee at the cafe across the street. The next 2 hours flew by. Abraham talked about his business, how he started with a small crew and one truck and ended up with a company that built half the new houses in Flower Mound. I talked about my job at Harlow's, my years of single motherhood, my recent retirement. We carefully avoided the subject of our past. It was as if we had an unspoken agreement not to reopen old wounds. But when the conversation turned to family, I noticed his shoulders tense. "I never got married," he said, stirring the cooled coffee. "I came close twice, but—" he shrugged. "Didn't work out." "Kids?" "No." He shook his head. "What about Lawrence?" I sighed, not knowing where to begin. "He's had a good job. Data analyst for a big company. Married, 2 teenage kids. You must be proud of him." I looked away, staring at my coffee mug. "Of course I am. He's smart, successful." Abraham put his hand over mine. His palm was warm and rough. "But there's always been a kind of distance," I admitted. I thought it would go away when he got older, but it just got worse. It was the first time I'd confessed out loud in years. Who else could I talk to about my painful relationship with my son? With coworkers who excitedly showed cards and gifts from their children every Mother's Day? With neighbors whose children and grandchildren visited regularly? "I'm sorry," I tried to smile. "No need to mar the meeting with old complaints." "Hilda," Abraham said gravely, "you could always talk to me about anything. That hasn't changed." Something in his gaze, in the firmness of his voice, made me believe him, and the words came pouring out. About how I tried to give Lawrence everything he needed. How I worked 2 jobs to pay for college. How I denied myself everything to save for his future, and how it all seemed to only drive us further apart. Lawrence rarely called, came even less often. At family gatherings, he kept aloof, as if he were performing an unpleasant duty. His wife Verity was polite but cold. The grandchildren, Audrey and Sebastian, were preoccupied with gadgets and hardly spoke to me. The last time he came, it was only to ask for money for a new car. I finished. I said no. I told him that my severance pay was already earmarked for house repairs. He was unhappy. Abraham listened without interrupting. When I finished, he squeezed my hand. "You did everything you could for him, more than most parents. Perhaps it's time to think about yourself." Those simple words, spoken with such conviction, awakened something long forgotten in me. Didn't I deserve a little happiness after so many years of sacrifice? As we parted, we exchanged phone numbers. Abraham promised to call me in a couple days to invite me to dinner. "I'm serious, Hilda," he said as he helped me into the car. "I'd like to know what you've become over the years, if you'll let me." I nodded, not trusting my voice. On the drive home, I thought about our meeting, about how easy it had been to talk to him, as if the decades of separation hadn't happened, and how it was the first time in a long time that someone had really listened to me. At home, I set the grocery bags on the kitchen table and glanced at my phone. The indicator light was blinking. 2 missed calls from Lawrence. No voicemails, no texts, just calls I'd missed while I was with Abraham. My finger hovered over the call button. I almost pressed it, almost returned to my familiar role as a mother. Always available, always ready to respond to my son's every request. But something stopped me. "It's time to think about yourself." Abraham's words echoed in my head. I put the phone away and started sorting through my purchases. Lawrence could wait. For the first time in years, I felt like my life could change. That perhaps not all was not yet lost on old Hilda Ansley. It's amazing how quickly a person can become the center of your life. In the 6 months I'd been seeing Abraham, it was as if I'd returned to my youth, but without its naivety and foolishness. We went to the movies on Wednesdays when tickets were discounted for seniors. On Saturdays, we had breakfast at the little bakery on the corner of Maple Street, where they served cinnamon rolls that melted in your mouth. Sometimes we'd just sit on a park bench and watch the kids chase the pigeons. Abraham never rushed things. He took my hand as gently as if I were a fragile relic that could be damaged by a careless touch. The first time he kissed me, lightly, almost weightlessly, I felt ridiculously, girlishly embarrassed. At 73, he didn't talk about love directly, but I could see it in his eyes, in the way he listened to my stories about working at Harlow and Associates, which could hardly be of interest to anyone else, in the way he brought me flowers, not luxurious bouquets from the flower store, but simple wildflowers he'd picked on his morning walks. "You need to live life to the fullest, Hilda," he said. "You've existed in the shadows for too long." I tried to explain to Lawrence why I was answering his calls less often and refusing to babysit when he and Verity needed to go out. "I made a friend," I said during one of my son's rare visits. "We spend time together." Lawrence looked at me with an expression I couldn't decipher. Bewilderment? Distrust? "A friend?" he interjected. "At your age? What's so strange about that?" I tried to keep my voice light. "Abraham is a very interesting man. We've known each other since we were young." "Abraham Pettigrew? The one from Pettigrew Construction?" I nodded, surprised that my son knew about Abraham's company. "They built our office complex," Lawrence explained. "Is the old man still running the business?" "He retired a couple years ago," I answered. "His nephew runs the company now." "But Pettigrew is still the owner?" There was a strange glint in his eyes that I didn't like he wasn't evaluating a man, but his bank account. "Abraham doesn't like to discuss business matters," I said dryly. Lawrence shrugged with feigned indifference. "Just curious. I'm glad you're not bored in retirement." The topic was closed, but I felt that my son was more interested in it than he showed. The fall that year was unusually beautiful. The trees and flower mounds seemed to compete in the brightness of their colors, from golden yellow to deep purple. Abraham and I often walked through the city park, rustling the fallen leaves like children. One evening, as we sat on my front porch watching the sunset, Abraham took my hand. "Hilda," his voice sounded more serious than usual, "I have something important to tell you." My heart beat faster. Was he really going to propose? At our age, it seemed both ridiculous and touching. "I saw the doctor last week," he continued. "The news wasn't good." A chill ran through my veins. "What's wrong?" I asked, squeezing his hand. "Cancer, pancreatic, stage 4. The world seemed to stop. The golden leaves swirling in the air froze. The sound of passing cars became distant, muffled. "But there has to be a cure, right? Surgery, chemotherapy." Abraham shook his head. "I've consulted with the best specialists. They say that in my case, treatment will only delay the inevitable for a couple months and make those months horrible. I've decided against it." "You can't just give up," I exclaimed, tears welling up in my eyes. "That's not surrender, Hilda," he objected gently. "It's acceptance. I'm 75 years old. I've lived a good life. And these last months with you, they've been a gift I never expected." I cried against his shoulder, and he stroked my back as if comforting a child. We sat like that until dark, talking about what was and what wouldn't be. The next 3 months flew by like a blink of an eye. We tried to fill each day with something meaningful. Abraham made a list of things he wanted to do. Some were simple: watching the sunrise from Flower Mountain, trying exotic dishes at a restaurant that had recently opened downtown. Others were more ambitious, like a short trip to the Grand Canyon. I accompanied him everywhere, trying not to show how frightened I was by the changes in his appearance. He was losing weight. His skin had taken on a yellowish tint, and his eyes were drooping, but his spirit remained unbroken. He joked about how he could now wear jeans that hadn't fit him in decades. In those days, I barely spoke to Lawrence. He called a couple times to ask how I was doing, but the conversations were short and perfunctory. One day, he stopped by unannounced and found Abraham at my house. We had just returned from the hospital after another checkup, and Abraham looked particularly exhausted. Lawrence barely nodded in his direction before he started talking about some family dinner I was supposed to attend. I declined, explaining the situation. My son listened to me with an impenetrable face, then shifted his gaze to Abraham. "I'm sorry for your situation, Mr. Pettigrew," he said in a tone that lacked any sincerity. "I hope you are receiving proper care. Your mother is the best caregiver one could dream of." Abraham smiled weakly. "I don't doubt it," Lawrence replied dryly. "Mother has always been selfless." After his son left, Abraham stared out the window for a long time. "He doesn't approve of us," he said at last. "It doesn't matter." I walked over and hugged him from behind, feeling his ribs bulge under his shirt. "We're the only ones that matter." For the past month, Abraham had barely gotten out of bed. I moved in to care for him around the clock. His large colonial-style home, always so neat and tidy, was now filled with medical equipment. A visiting nurse showed me how to change IVs and give painkiller shots. One night, as I sat beside his bed holding his hand, Abraham suddenly opened his eyes and looked at me with surprising clarity. "Hilda," he said quietly, "I made a new will a month ago. I wanted to tell you, but the moment never came." "Shh," I stroked his hair, thinning with illness. "Don't think about it now." "No, listen." He squeezed my hand with unexpected strength. "I'm leaving you everything. The house, the accounts, the company stock. I'm leaving them to you." I stared at him, unable to comprehend what I was hearing. "But, your nephew? Shouldn't he—" "Robbie gets to run the company. It's already in the contracts. But personal property is yours. I want you to live the life you deserve, Hilda, without worrying about money, without having to save for every little thing." "I can't accept that," I whispered. "You can and you will." His voice sounded unexpectedly firm. "Who else am I going to leave all this to? I have no children. There's no one closer to you." He smiled weakly. "Besides, this is my way of apologizing for leaving you so soon." Abraham died a week later, quietly, in his sleep. I was beside him, holding his hand as his breathing became shallower, then stopped altogether. The room was quiet, with only the ticking of the clock on the wall counting down the seconds without him. The funeral was businesslike and orderly. Abraham had planned everything in advance, saving me from having to make decisions while I was grieving. The ceremony was modest but dignified. His former colleagues, business associates, a few distant relatives showed up. Lawrence showed up too, expressing his condolences with an expression befitting the occasion. 2 weeks after the funeral, I was invited by Abraham's lawyer, Mr. Holt. He read the will, which confirmed what Abraham had told me. I inherited everything: $1 million house, bank accounts, a stock portfolio, including a controlling interest in Pettigrew Construction. "All in all, Mrs. Ansley, your inheritance is worth about $7 million, Mr. Holt said, looking at me over his glasses. Mr. Pettigrew was a very successful businessman and, by all accounts, a very frugal man. I sat stunned by the figure, $7 million. For a woman who had spent her life counting every penny, it seemed unreal. "There's something else," the lawyer continued, handing me an envelope. "Mr. Pettigrew left this for you, a personal message." At home, I opened the envelope. Inside was a letter written in Abraham's familiar, neat handwriting. "Dear Hilda, if you are reading this, it means I am no longer with you. Don't be too sad. I leave with peace in my heart, grateful for the time we spent together. I know you'll feel bad about the inheritance, perhaps even guilty. Don't be. It's my choice, and I'm happy to be able to take care of you in this way. Use the money, Hilda. Travel, buy nice things. Do all the things you've denied yourself for years. You deserve it more than anyone. One more thing. I know things are not going well between you and Lawrence. Don't let him manipulate you. You've done your duty as a mother to the fullest. Now live for yourself. With eternal love, Abraham. I clutched the letter to my chest and finally allowed myself to cry, really, tearfully, as I had never cried, not even at a funeral. A few days later, I told Lawrence about the inheritance. It had been a mistake. His eyes narrowed when I mentioned the amount. 7 million? He asked me again. And it's all yours now? Yes, I answered, squirming uncomfortably under his gaze. Abraham was very generous. Suspiciously generous, I'd say, Lawrence said. You were together. How long? 6 months. And he left you his entire fortune? Don't you think that's odd? We'd known each other all our lives, I objected, and he had no direct heirs. What about the nephew, the one who runs the company? Robbie got to run the business like he wanted. He'd never been interested in Abraham's personal fortune. Lawrence leaned back in his chair, his face taking on a calculating expression. What do you plan to do with this money? I don't know, I answered honestly. Travel, maybe. Abraham wanted me to see the world. Travel at your age? He snorted. Mom, be realistic. You're 73. You have arthritis and high blood pressure. What kind of traveling? His words hurt, but I didn't let on. I'm perfectly fine for my age, I said calmly. And it's my money, Lawrence. I will use it as I see fit. He stared at me for a few seconds. Then his face softened. Of course, Mother. I'm just worried about you. It's a huge amount of money, and there are a lot of scammers who prey on older people with money. Why don't you let me help you manage your finances? I have experience in these things. Mr. Holt, Abraham's lawyer, has already offered his services, I replied. He's been handling Abraham's affairs for years, and I trust his experience. Lawrence pressed his lips together. Whatever you say, but think about it. After all, that money will go to me and the children someday. Wouldn't it be better if I knew how to manage it? There was such certainty in his voice, such entitlement to my inheritance, that I felt anger rising inside. Nothing is settled, Lawrence, I said coldly, and it is my money now, only mine. He left shortly afterward, but the look on his face, a mixture of displeasure and greed, stayed with me. I knew my son. He would not leave the subject. A week later, he called with an offer of a family dinner. We need to discuss your future, he said in a tone that brooked no objection. I agreed, figuring it would be better to be clear right away. The dinner was in their house, spacious but impersonal, like a picture in a furniture catalog. Verity, Lawrence's wife, fussed in the kitchen, occasionally casting nervous glances in my direction. The children, 15-year-old Audrey and 13-year-old Sebastian, had been sent to a friend's house. Mom, Lawrence began as we sat down at the table, Verity and I have been thinking a lot about your situation, and we have a suggestion. I waited silently, forcing a piece of roast beef onto my fork. We think you should move in with us. There's a guest room in the house that we can convert. You won't have to live alone. We'll keep an eye on you. What about my house? I asked, even though I already knew the answer. You could sell it, Verity interjected with feigned concern. Or rent it out. It's an extra income. And of course, we'll take care of your finances, Lawrence added. No worries, no stress. Just a peaceful old age with your family. I put down my fork and looked at my son. What about Abraham's house? It should be sold too, of course. Lawrence shrugged. Why do you need two houses? And shares in the company? Mother, his tone became condescending. You don't know anything about stocks and investments. I'll take care of it, trust me. I looked at them in silence, at my son and his wife, so confident, so sure of their right to control my life and my money, and something finally broke inside me. No, I said quietly but firmly. What? Lawrence blinked as if he hadn't heard me. I said no. I'm not moving in with you. I'm not selling my house. And I'm certainly not going to let you manage my money. His face darkened. Mom, you don't understand. I understand perfectly well, I interrupted him. You want to control my inheritance, but that's not going to happen. It's not just your money, he suddenly blurted out. It's my inheritance, too. Lawrence, Verity shook him off, casting a frightened glance in my direction. But it was too late. The masks were off. You're right, I nodded. This is your inheritance, which you can have after I die if I decide to leave it to you. Until then, it's my money, and I'll dispose of it as I see fit. I'm up from the table. Thank you for dinner. I'd better get home. Sit down, Lawrence shouted, slamming his fist on the table. We're not done yet. Verity flinched, but didn't say anything. I stared at my son, not recognizing him. Where had the boy I'd taught to ride a bike gone? The one I read bedtime stories to? When did he turn into that greedy, evil man? We're done, Lawrence, I said quietly. At least for today. I walked out of their house with a heavy heart, but with a clear head. I knew now exactly what my son wanted, and I knew I wouldn't let him get it. 3 days later, I got a call from Mr. Holt. Mrs. Ansley, he said in a concerned tone, your son just came out of my office. He was interested in the details of Mr. Pettigrew's will and the possibilities of contesting it. And what did you tell him? I asked, feeling my back grow cold. That the will was impeccable and had no legal vulnerabilities. But I must warn you, he was very persistent. And he mentioned something about your, instability after Mr. Pettigrew's death. I closed my eyes. So that's how it is. If Lawrence can't challenge Abraham's will, he'll try to question my capacity, declare me incompetent, and take control of my finances as legal guardian. Thank you for the warning, Mr. Holt, I said. I think I need legal advice. Absolutely, Mrs. Ansley. And I would recommend that you don't delay. When I hung up, I sat motionless for a long time, looking out the window at the neat houses of my neighbors. Somewhere out there, in one of those houses, my son was planning how to take away my last chance for freedom and independence. Well, Lawrence, game on. I'd never been to the courthouse before. On TV, it always looked like an imposing, almost majestic place. But the Flower Mound County Courthouse was just an ordinary two-story red brick building with cracked steps and creaky doors. Inside, it smelled of dust, old paper, and tension. I arrived early, as advised by my attorney, Delilah Robbins, an energetic woman in her 50s with a short haircut and a sharp mind. We met through Mr. Holt, who recommended her as a family law specialist with extensive experience in incapacity cases. Hilda, remember what we talked about? Delilah adjusted the collar of my blouse before entering the courtroom. Stay calm, answer clearly and to the point. No emotional outbursts, even if you're provoked. I nodded, clutching my purse in my hands. Inside was an envelope I hoped I wouldn't have to take out today. It was my last trump card, a weapon I'd rather never use. But Lawrence had left me no choice. Within 2 months of our last conversation, my son had launched a real campaign. He called my neighbors asking if they'd noticed any strange behavior. He contacted my former doctor, trying to gain access to my medical records. Twice he showed up at my house unannounced, asking about my health with fake concern and unexpectedly finding expired medications in my medicine cabinet. When all these methods didn't work, Lawrence filed a formal lawsuit seeking to have me declared incompetent and to have him appointed my guardian. Grounds? age-related dementia, inability to make rational financial decisions, and susceptibility to manipulation by third parties were all listed in the papers the sheriff handed me one rainy Tuesday. At the same time, Lawrence launched another lawsuit. He was trying to contest Abraham's will on the grounds that he had allegedly been under my undue influence during the last months of his life. This part of his strategy drew my ire even more than trying to declare me insane. Abraham was sane until the very end, I told Delilah during our first meeting, and his decision to leave me an inheritance was made long before his illness. Mr. Holt can attest to that. He will, Delilah nodded. But we need to be prepared for foul play, Hilda. From the looks of it, your son will stop at nothing. She was right. As the hearing date approached, Lawrence's pressure only increased. He even brought in his children, my grandchildren, forcing them to write touching letters about how they were worried about Grandma. Sebastian, a 13-year-old who barely looked in my direction on rare encounters, suddenly became an expert on my mental health. Grandma often forgets things and gets confused. Read his letter, clearly written at his father's dictation. Verity, Lawrence's wife, was the only one who showed even a hint of conscience. She called me late one night, a week before the trial. Hilda, she said quietly, as if afraid of being overheard, I just want you to know that I don't agree with what Lawrence is doing. It's wrong. Then why are you supporting him? I asked. The pause on the other end of the line was long. We're having money problems, she finally admitted. Big problems. Lawrence has made some bad investments. We could lose the house. I grinned bitterly. So that's what this is all about. Not just greed, but desperation. And my inheritance is your lifeline? I know how that sounds. Verity's voice was sincerely pained. But children, they're used to a certain standard of living. And Lawrence, he's not a man who takes failure lightly. Enough excuses, Verity. I cut her off. You and Lawrence are adults. If you have financial problems, handle them like adults. Don't try to steal an old woman's money under the guise of fake concern. I hung up the phone, feeling a mixture of anger and frustration. And now, sitting on the hard bench in the courtroom, I felt the same emotions, looking across the hall at the opposite side, where Lawrence, Verity, and their attorney, a burly man in an expensive suit with a shark smile, were seated. Case number 123, fraction 2025, Ansley versus Ansley, announced the bailiff. We entered the courtroom. Judge Tempest Huxley appeared to be a tall woman with gray hair gathered in a tight bundle and shrewd eyes. She quickly reviewed the documents in front of her, then looked up at those gathered. So, Mr. Ansley requests that his mother, Mrs. Hilda Ansley, be declared incompetent and that he be appointed her legal guardian, the judge concluded. On what grounds? Lawrence's attorney, Mr. Pierce, rose from his seat. Your Honor, it has become apparent to my client that his mother, a decent woman, is unfortunately no longer capable of making rational decisions, especially in financial matters. She recently inherited a substantial amount of money that we believe she is unable to properly utilize due to age-related cognitive impairments. Delilah snorted next to me, but Judge Huxley gestured her to order. Proceed, Mr. Pierce. What evidence can you present? For the next half hour, I had to listen to my own son, through his representative, tell the court about my inadequacy. According to him, I was forgetting important dates, mixing up grandchildren's names, leaving the stove on, and showing signs of paranoia, claiming that everyone is out to get my money. The judge listened attentively, occasionally taking notes. Her face remained impassive. Mrs. Robbins, she turned to my attorney when Pierce had finished, what do you have to say in defense of your client? Delilah stood up, straightening her back. Your Honor, all of the charges against my client are nothing more than an attempt by her son to gain control of a large inheritance that Mrs. Ansley received from a close friend. We have the results of a recent medical exam that showed no evidence of dementia or other cognitive impairment. Mrs. Ansley is fully capable of managing her own finances. She handed the judge a folder of documents. Judge Huxley took a quick look at them, then looked up again. What about the charges of forgetfulness and dangerous behavior? Exaggerations and outright lies, Your Honor. For example, the stove incident Mr. Pierce mentioned occurred one day when Mrs. Ansley was distracted by a phone call from Mr. Ansley Jr. himself. As for the names of the grandchildren, Mrs. Ansley rarely sees them because her son limits their contact. I cast a glance at Lawrence. He sat stone-faced, but I could see a vein pulsing on his temple, a sure sign of restrained rage that I remembered from his teenage years. We'd also like to note, Delilah continued, that until Mr. Pettigrew's inheritance, Mr. Ansley Jr. had never shown any concern for his mother's mental state. On the contrary, he was quite content to let her live on her own, manage her finances, and even help with his children. His sudden concern came only after his mother became a wealthy woman. Lawrence's attorney jumped in. Objection. This is speculation unsupported by facts. Sustained, the judge nodded. Mrs. Robbins, stick to the facts. Delilah bowed her head in agreement, but her eyes glittered. She'd accomplished what she'd set out to do. Sow doubt about Lawrence's motives. The hearing continued with the calling of witnesses. Lawrence invited my neighbor, Mrs. Clark, who reluctantly confirmed that she had once seen me distraught, looking for my house keys, which had ended up in my pocket. My former physician, Dr. Gilbert, then spoke, but his testimony was rather in my favor. He noted that in 20 years of observation, he had noticed no signs of dementia in me, and my physical health was exceptional for a woman of her age. Finally, Judge Huxley turned to me. Mrs. Ansley, is there anything you wish to say to the court? I rose slowly, feeling the stares of everyone present. Lawrence's gaze was particularly hard, a mixture of certainty of victory and ill-concealed impatience. Your Honor, I began, trying to keep my voice from shaking. I have lived an honest and honorable life for 73 years. 38 years I worked as an accountant in one company, raised my son alone, without any help from his father, who left us when Lawrence was 5. I paused, gathering my thoughts. I'd saved money on everything: clothes, vacations, basic pleasures, so that my son could get a good education, so that he could have what I didn't have. And you know what? I don't regret anything, because it was my choice, my life. Lawrence squirmed in his seat. Verity lowered her eyes, clearly uncomfortable. When Abraham came back into my life, and especially when he left me his inheritance, I felt free for the first time. The ability to live my remaining years the way I wanted, not the way circumstances dictated. Suddenly, my son, to whom I gave everything, decides I'm incapacitated. Is it because I finally want to live for myself, or because I now have money that he thinks is his? Objection. Mr. Pierce has jumped in again. The defendant is drawing unfounded conclusions about my client's motives. Your Honor, Delilah interjected, Mrs. Ansley is simply expressing her perception of the situation, which is perfectly acceptable in this context. Judge Huxley nodded. Go ahead, Mrs. Ansley, but please refrain from speculating about the motives of the other participants in the trial. I took a deep breath. I'm sorry, Your Honor. I just want to say that I'm of sound mind. I'm capable of making decisions, and I want the right to control my life and my money without interference from anyone else. The judge looked at me carefully, tilting her head slightly. Thank you, Mrs. Ansley. Mr. Ansley, Jr., do you have anything to add? Lawrence stood up, pulling on his jacket. Your Honor, I am deeply distressed that my mother sees my concern for her as an infringement on her freedom. I merely wish to protect her from potential mistakes and manipulation. After all, $7 million is a huge amount of money that could attract all sorts of crooks. He threw me a look full of feigned concern. Mom, you know how much I love you. Everything I do is for your good. Something in his tone, in that fake tenderness, was the last straw. I felt a wave rise inside me. Not anger, even, but some cold, clear decision. Lawrence, I said quietly but firmly, you've always been a liar. As a child, you learned to manipulate to get what you wanted. But this show is your worst performance yet. His eyes narrowed. You see, Your Honor, she's getting paranoid, blaming me. This old lady is spending all the money she doesn't deserve. Lawrence suddenly shouted, losing his temper. Now she's going to give me back everything from her inheritance. There was silence in the courtroom. Even Judge Huxley seemed stunned by this outburst. Mr. Ansley, pull yourself together, she said sternly. One more prank like that, and I'll find you guilty of contempt of court. Lawrence turned pale, realizing his mistake. But it was too late. His true colors were all too apparent. I looked at him, this strange man who had once been my son, and I realized that I could no longer put off what I had to do. Slowly, I opened my purse and pulled out the envelope I had kept secret for so many years. Your Honor, I said, holding it out to Delilah, I would like to present to the court a document that is directly relevant to the case. My attorney, surprised, we hadn't discussed this move, took the envelope and, after a brief hesitation, handed it to the judge. Judge Huxley opened the envelope, extracted the contents, and scrutinized the papers. Her eyebrows rose in surprise. Mrs. Ansley, this is very unusual, she said at last. Are you sure you want to give this information to the court? Yes, Your Honor, I answered firmly. It's a truth I've kept hidden for too long, and it's time Lawrence knew it. What is this about? Lawrence asked sharply, turning to his lawyer, who only shrugged his shoulders in bewilderment. Judge Huxley handed the documents to Mr. Pierce, who quickly looked through them and showed them to Lawrence with eyes widened with shock. I saw my son's face change from bewilderment to disbelief, then to rage. It's a fake, he shouted, jumping up. She made it all up. Mr. Ensley, the judge raised her voice warningly. Last warning. Lawrence slumped back in his seat, but his eyes burned with hatred as he glared at me. Mrs. Ansley, the judge turned to me, would you please explain to the court what these documents mean? I rose, feeling strangely calm. 43 years I had lived with this secret. 43 years of fear and guilt and silence. But now, looking at Lawrence, at his angry face, I realized that I was no longer afraid. Your Honor, I said, looking directly at the judge, these are the adoption papers. Lawrence is not my biological son. There were surprised exclamations in the courtroom. Verity covered her mouth with her hand, looking at her husband in amazement. You're not mine, I said, turning to Lawrence. You never were. Even the judge, who must have seen all sorts of things over the years, seemed shocked. She turned pale, looking at me and at the papers in front of her. It's a lie. Lawrence jumped up from his seat. She's just trying to disinherit me. Sit down, Mr. Ansley, the judge ordered, then turned to me. Mrs. Ansley, this is a serious statement. Are you prepared to testify to it under oath? I am, Your Honor, I replied, and I have additional evidence, including the testimony of the medical personnel who were present at the adoption. Adoption? Echoed the judge. Yes, Your Honor. If you take a closer look at the documents, you'll see that Lawrence is not biologically related to me or my ex-husband, Edgar Ansley. He was adopted by us shortly after he was born. Lawrence looked like he'd been kicked in the butt. He looked at me with an expression of such deep shock and betrayal that for a moment I almost regretted my decision, but only for a moment. If this is true, the judge said slowly, why have you kept this from Mr. Ansley his entire life? I took a deep breath, preparing to tell the story I'd never told anyone but Abraham. It's a long story and not a pleasant one, Your Honor, but I'm prepared to tell it if the court deems it necessary. Judge Huxley looked at me carefully, then at Lawrence, who sat with his head down, as if trying to comprehend what he had heard. In view of the unexpected turn of events, she said, I think it is necessary to adjourn. We will resume in an hour. Mrs. Ansley, be prepared to provide all the details of this situation. She banged her gavel, and the meeting was adjourned. As I walked out of the courtroom, feeling the stares of everyone present, Delilah said quietly to me, You're full of surprises, Hilda, but you should have warned your lawyer. I wasn't sure I'd have the strength to do it, I said honestly. Lawrence caught up with me in the corridor. His face was dead pale, his eyes red. How could you? He hissed. All these years, how could you keep the truth from me? I looked at him, this man I'd raised like a son, who I'd given everything I had, and who was now trying to take the last of it away from me. I was going to take that secret to my grave, I answered quietly. But you gave me no choice, Lawrence. You brought us here. He recoiled from me as if I were a leper. Who am I? He asked in a choked voice. If not your son, then who? You'll know the truth in an hour, I said, feeling a strange mixture of relief and pain. Whether you're ready for that is another question. Back in the courtroom after the recess, I felt strangely calm. For 43 years, I had lived with this secret, carried it around like a heavy stone. Now that it was out, I felt both exhausted and relieved. Judge Huxley looked at me carefully as I took my seat. Lawrence sat across from me, pale and tense, avoiding my gaze. Next to him, Verity looked confused and depressed. We're adjourned, the judge announced. Mrs. Ansley, you have stated that Lawrence Ansley is not your biological son and was adopted by you. The court asks that you provide full information about the circumstances of that adoption. I stood up, feeling my heart pounding. Where to begin the story that changed my entire life? Your Honor, in order for the court to understand the big picture, I need to go back in time, to the year 1975, to be exact. The judge nodded, giving me permission to continue. I was 23 years old when I married Edgar Ansley. He was handsome, charismatic, and, as I later realized, a completely irresponsible man. But I was young and in love then. I paused, gathering my thoughts. The memories I had so carefully buried were now surfacing with painful clarity. The first years of marriage had been tolerable. Edgar changed jobs often. We moved from town to town. Finally settled here in Flower Mound when he was offered a position at an ad agency. I took a job at Harlow and Associates, where I worked for the rest of my life. I glanced at Lawrence. He sat staring at me with a look on his face as if he were listening to a story about complete strangers. After 3 years of marriage, I desperately wanted a child, but I couldn't get pregnant. We consulted doctors and underwent tests. It turned out that my fallopian tubes were obstructed and there was virtually no chance of natural conception. In those days, there were not the same possibilities of assisted reproduction as there are now. I felt a lump in my throat. Even after all these years, the memory of that despair, when I knew I could never bear a child, was painful. Edgar wasn't too worried about it. He said that the two of us were fine, that there would be time for us to have children, but I could see that he was okay with it. Edgar had always been a selfish man. A child would mean responsibilities he didn't want to take on. The judge listened intently, occasionally making notes. Delilah sat next to me, maintaining a professional calm, though I knew this story was new to her too. I had only told her the basic facts during the break. In 1977, I noticed a change in Edgar's behavior. He started staying late at work, coming back smelling of perfume I didn't use. Classic picture of adultery. I grinned bitterly. I didn't make a scene. I didn't follow him. I just waited for him to confess, or for it to go away. But something else happened. I took a deep breath, coming to the hardest part of the story. In September of that year, Edgar came home earlier than usual, visibly agitated. He said we needed to have a serious talk. I thought he was going to confess to cheating, or worse, ask for a divorce. But he said, "Tilly's pregnant." Tilly Ross was his colleague at the ad agency, a young copywriter. There was complete silence in the courtroom. Even Judge Huxley seemed to hold her breath. I was shocked at first, then angry. We fought all night. I screamed that he'd betrayed me, that he'd ruined our family. He made excuses, saying it was just a brief affair, that he only loved me. I shook my head, remembering. Typical excuses of an unfaithful husband. But then he said something that changed everything. Tilly doesn't want this baby. She's going to have an abortion. I looked at Lawrence. He raised his head, and our eyes met. There was shock and something else in his gaze, maybe the beginning of understanding. "You must understand, Your Honor," I continued, turning to the judge, "that I desperately wanted a child. For years I had dreamed of motherhood, and to find out that my husband was going to have a child with another woman who didn't want him, it was too much. That night I made the craziest and possibly the most important decision of my life." "And what was that decision?" Judge Huxley asked quietly. "I offered to take the baby," I answered simply. "I told Edgar that if Tilly agreed to carry and deliver, we would take the baby and raise it as our own." Edgar was stunned. He hadn't expected this. But it was good for him. It saved him from a scandal at work, from child support, from having to explain things to his parents. I paused, remembering the next events. The next day, Edgar talked to Tilly. I don't know exactly what he said to her, but 2 days later, they both came to our house. Tilly was a beautiful girl, about 5 years younger than me, with a mop of red hair and freckles. She was scared and embarrassed, but she agreed to see us. I remembered that night in detail, how we sat in the living room, trying to discuss the fate of the unborn child as if it were a business deal. How I'd tried not to show any jealousy or anger, not to scare the girl away. How she avoided looking me in the eye. I offered her a deal. She carries the baby. We pay all medical expenses and give her a certain amount of money. After the birth, she gives up her parental rights, and Edgar and I adopt the baby. She was to leave Flower Mound, get a job in another city, and never have contact with us again. "And she agreed to that?" Judge Huxley asked. "Not right away." I shook my head. At first, she was shocked by my offer, said she needed to think about it. A week later, she called and agreed, with one condition. She wanted twice the money we'd originally offered. Edgar was against it. The amount was significant to our budget. But I insisted. I was willing to do anything to get this baby. I glanced at Lawrence. He sat motionless, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles turned white. The next few months were strange. Edgar and I started pretending I was pregnant. I wore loose clothes. We told my parents and friends the happy news. I even took a little maternity leave from work. Meanwhile, Tilly was seeing a doctor in a neighboring town where we took her once a month. Edgar and Tilly had ended their relationship. At least that's what he told me. I sighed, remembering that tense time. In May of 1978, Tilly gave birth to a baby boy. Edgar and I arrived at the hospital right after the birth. The baby was tiny, with a fluff of dark hair and bright blue eyes. Tilly didn't even want to look at him. She signed all the necessary papers, took the money, and disappeared from our lives. As far as I knew, she moved to California and never contacted us or the baby again. I looked directly at Lawrence. We named the boy Lawrence Edgar Ensley and officially registered him as our biological son. That was illegal, Judge Huxley observed. Yes, Your Honor, I agreed. But in those days, the process wasn't as strict, especially in small towns. Tilly gave birth in Pinewood, 50 kilometers from here. The doctor who delivered the baby was a friend of Edgar's from high school. He agreed to list us as the biological parents on the birth certificate. Tilly was fine with that. She didn't want any ties to the baby. So there was no formal adoption? The judge clarified. No, Your Honor. Formally, according to the documents, Lawrence has always been our biological son, but I still have Tilly's letters and a receipt for money, where she admits that she is the biological mother and waives all rights to the child. These are the documents I presented to the court. Lawrence's attorney, Mr. Pierce, who until this point had sat stunned, finally intervened. Your Honor, even if this, extraordinary story is true, it has no legal relevance to this case. Mr. Ansley was registered as the defendant's son, was raised by her, and has all legal rights, including the right to care for his elderly mother's welfare. Take your time, Mr. Pierce. Judge Huxley stopped him. Let's hear the full story before drawing legal conclusions. Mrs. Ansley, please continue. I nodded. The early years were happy as far as they could be. Lawrence was a healthy, active child. Edgar seemed attached to him, though he had never been a particularly involved father. And I loved Lawrence with all my heart. He was my son, regardless of the circumstances of his arrival. I looked at the man sitting across from me, adult, fierce, but still the same boy I'd put to bed, read stories to, bandaged whose broken knees I'd bandaged. When Lawrence was 5, our marriage to Edgar finally fell apart. He had never been a faithful husband, but I tolerated it, believing that it was better for the child to grow up in a complete family. However, in 1983, Edgar met a woman with whom he wanted to start a new life. He left, leaving Lawrence and me alone. I paused, remembering those difficult days. In the divorce, Edgar gave up his parental rights to Lawrence. He didn't want to pay child support, didn't want any responsibility. Said that since the boy wasn't his real son, he had no obligations. I thought Edgar was the biological father. Judge Huxley intervened, confused. No, Your Honor. I shook my head. I missed that point. When Tilly had agreed to our deal, she had indicated that Edgar wasn't the only man she was close to at the time. She wasn't sure who the child's biological father was. And Mr. Ansley knew this? Yes, he did. But he didn't care at the time. He just wanted to avoid a scandal. And when he decided to leave us, he used that as an excuse for his indifference. I glanced again at Lawrence, who sat with his head down. His shoulders were visibly shaking. After Edgar left, it was just the two of us. I worked full-time at Harlow's, plus some part-time work in the evenings, doing bookkeeping for a small business. We still didn't have enough money. We lived very modestly, but I made sure Lawrence never felt deprived. I sighed, remembering the years of constant saving, denying myself everything so my son could have what the other children had. When it came time to go to college, Lawrence received a partial scholarship, but it wasn't enough to fully cover his expenses. I took out a second mortgage on the house to pay for his education. Those were tough years, but I didn't regret a thing. Lawrence was a smart, capable boy. I believed he would succeed. I looked at my son again. His face was hidden in the palms of his hands. After college, Lawrence got a good job, married Verity, and they had children. My life fell into a calm routine. I paid off my loans, became a senior accountant at Harlow's, even managed to save small amounts for retirement. My relationship with Lawrence became more distant, but I put that down to the natural course of things. He was a grown man with his own family, his own concerns. Mrs. Ansley, Judge Huxley interrupted me, you mentioned in your statement that you never told Lawrence the truth about his origins. Why? It was a key question, and I'd been preparing for it for a long time during the recess. But it was still painful to answer, especially looking into the eyes of the man from whom I had hidden the truth for so many years. Edgar and I had originally decided that Lawrence would never find out that he was adopted. It was a selfish decision, I admit. We were afraid that if he found out the truth, he would hate us or want to find his birth mother. And then when Edgar left, I paused. I was left alone with this secret and a 5-year-old who had just lost his father. I couldn't bring myself to tell him that not only had his father abandoned us, but that he wasn't his real father at all. Judge Huxley nodded understandingly. And later? Later it became even more difficult. The more time passed, the harder it was to find the moment for such a confession. How do you tell a teenager that his whole life had been built on lies? How do you tell a grown man that the woman he thought was his mother had been deceiving him since birth? I felt tears come to my eyes. I convinced myself that I was protecting him, that it was for the best. But deep down, I knew I was protecting myself first and foremost from his anger, from the possibility of losing him. I was afraid that if he knew the truth, he would stop thinking of me as his mother. I looked at Lawrence, who had finally raised his head. His face was wet with tears, his eyes red. "I'm sorry," I told him quietly. "I should have told you a long time ago, but I was so afraid of losing your love. And then, when you grew up, it seemed that the truth would only ruin everything, not do any good." Lawrence looked at me in silence. There was such a storm of emotion in his gaze that it was impossible to make out what he was feeling. "There was only one man who knew the truth," I continued, turning back to the judge. "Abraham Pettigrew. We'd been friends before I married Edgar. When Edgar left, Abraham offered to help me. Then, in a moment of desperation, I told him everything. He was the only one I could share this burden with." "The same Abraham Pettigrew who left you the inheritance?" the judge asked. "Yes, Your Honor. After that conversation, we drifted apart. My fault, I was too proud to accept his help. But he never forgot about us. Sometimes sent Lawrence Christmas presents anonymously. A few times he helped me financially when things were particularly bad, though I tried to pay that money back. And you rekindled your relationship shortly before his death, I take it." "Yes, we met by chance last year. It turned out that our feelings for each other hadn't faded over the years." I paused to collect my thoughts. "Your Honor, I know the information I've provided may seem incredible, but all the documents are authentic, and if necessary, I am willing to undergo a DNA test to confirm that Lawrence is not my biological son." Judge Huxley scrutinized the papers in front of her. "A question for Mr. Ansley," she said finally. "Have you ever suspected your ancestry?" Lawrence seemed to have difficulty coming to his senses. "No, Your Honor." His voice sounded hoarse. "Never. Do you have any questions for Mrs. Ansley?" Lawrence looked at me for a long moment. "Only one," he said. "Why now? Why did you decide to tell the truth now?" I held his gaze. "Because you've left me no choice, Lawrence. You're trying to take away what I hold dear, my independence, my chance for a peaceful old age, and you're doing it under the guise of taking care of your mother. But the truth is, you're only interested in money. It's always been about them." His face contorted. "You're lying," he shouted. "You've been lying to me all my life, and you're still lying to me." "Mr. Ansley," Judge Huxley said warningly. "No, Your Honor," Lawrence persisted. She made up the whole story to disinherit me. She fabricated the documents. It's a conspiracy. Mr. Ensley, the judge raised her voice. One more stunt like that, and I'll have you removed from this courtroom. Lawrence was silent, but his eyes burned with hatred. I looked at him sadly. This man whom I had raised, to whom I had given everything, my youth, my strength, my dreams, was now looking at me as an enemy. Perhaps it was my own fault. Perhaps my decades-long lies had brought us to this moment. Your Honor, I said quietly, I admit I made a mistake in hiding the truth for so many years, but I never lied about my love for Lawrence. He was and still is my son, not by blood, but by everything else. I raised him, cared for him, loved him as my own, and even now, when he tries to take away the last thing I have, I can't stop thinking of him as my son. Judge Huxley looked at me thoughtfully. Mrs. Ansley, do you understand that disclosure of this information could have serious consequences not only for this case, but for your life in general? I do, Your Honor, but I had no choice. The judge nodded, then turned to the attorneys. Given the new circumstances, I'm adjourning the hearing until tomorrow. I need to review the documents and think about the legal implications of this situation. The session will continue tomorrow at 10 o'clock in the morning. She banged the gavel, and everyone started to rise. Lawrence jumped out of the hall without waiting for his wife. Verity gave me one last confused look before following him. Delilah leaned toward me. You're full of surprises, Hilda, but I have to admit, it's a strong move. Lawrence is unlikely to recover from such a blow. I didn't feel triumphant, only weariness and sadness. The secret I had kept for so long was now revealed. But instead of relief, I felt only emptiness. As I left the courthouse, I saw Lawrence arguing furiously with Verity in the parking lot. When he saw me, he stopped talking, then turned and walked briskly toward his car. Verity stood there, staring after him with a confused expression. For a moment, our gazes met across the parking lot. In her eyes, I saw not accusation, but a strange understanding. She gave me a slight nod before following her husband. I got into my car, feeling my hands shaking. 43 years of secrecy was over. What would happen next? I didn't know. But in a strange way, I didn't care anymore. I had done what I had to do. I had defended myself and my right to my own life, even if the cost was the last vestiges of a relationship with the man I had once called son. At home, I sat in silence for a long time, going through old photographs. Lawrence the baby with chubby cheeks. Lawrence the first grader with the gap-toothed smile. Lawrence the teenager, serious and a little sullen. Lawrence the college graduate, proud and confident. In all of these pictures was my son, not by blood, but by everything else. I didn't know if what had happened between us could be undone, whether a relationship could be repaired after such a betrayal, on both sides. But I knew one thing: the truth, no matter how bitter, was better than a lie. And now that it had finally come out, I could only wait to see what would happen next. The next morning was overcast. Low clouds hung over Flower Mound, promising rain by noon. I stayed up most of the night, going over the events of yesterday in my head, replaying the words that had been said in court, the look on Lawrence's face when he heard the truth. Delilah came to pick me up at 9 in the morning. She looked fresh and collected, unlike me. "How are you feeling?" she asked as we drove to the courthouse. "Like a person who has had a tooth extracted," I replied. "The pain is there, but so is the relief." Delilah smiled briefly. "Overnight, I double-checked all the documents you provided. They're in perfect order. If Lawrence tries to challenge their authenticity, we have proof. By the way," she added, giving me a quick glance, "I got a call from Lawrence's lawyer, Mr. Pierce." I tensed. What did he want? To discuss the possibility of an out-of-court settlement. Settlement? I looked at her in surprise. What kind of settlement? He didn't go into detail, but I understand that Lawrence is willing to give up his claim that you're incapacitated in exchange for certain financial guarantees. I snorted. In other words, he still wants my money, just in a different way. That's about right, Delilah agreed. I said I'd discuss it with you, but I made it clear that we were determined to go all the way. I nodded. Thank you. I really want to finish this case. For too long, I've let fear guide my decisions. As we pulled up to the courthouse, we saw several reporters with cameras and microphones. Delilah cursed quietly. Someone leaked the information to the press, she muttered. Apparently, our story was too juicy to stay in the shadows. We walked quickly past the reporters, ignoring the questions they shouted. The inside of the courthouse was already crowded, considerably more people than yesterday. Apparently, news of the unexpected turn in the Ansley versus Ansley case had spread quickly. In the hallway, I spotted Lawrence with Verity. He looked haggard, with dark circles under his eyes. She was standing next to him, but I could feel the tension between them. When Lawrence noticed me, his face contorted and he looked away. Ignore him, Delilah said quietly. Concentrate on the case. The courtroom was stuffy with people. Judge Huxley entered at 10 sharp, her face expressing nothing but professional concentration. We will continue with the case of Ansley versus Ansley, she announced. New evidence was presented to the court yesterday, which I have reviewed. There are a few issues that need clarification. She turned to Lawrence's attorney. Mr. Pierce, does your client dispute the authenticity of the documents presented by Mrs. Inslee? Pierce stood up, smoothing his immaculate suit. Your Honor, my client believes the documents may have been forged. We'd like to conduct an independent examination. The judge nodded. A reasonable request. Mrs. Robbins, does your client consent to such an examination? Delilah stood up. Your Honor, my client has no objection to the examination. However, we also feel it is necessary to conduct a DNA test to definitively establish that there is no biological relationship between Mrs. Ansley and Mr. Ansley, Jr. Objection, Pierce shrieked. The DNA test is irrelevant to the merits of the case. Regardless of biological parentage, Mr. Ansley is legally Mrs. Ansley's son, and his concern for her welfare remains legitimate. Judge Huxley raised her hand, calling for order. Mr. Pierce, the crux of this case is the establishment of guardianship over an allegedly incapacitated person. The biological relationship may not be of direct legal significance, but the circumstances under which that information was withheld and the motives of the parties to this conflict are highly relevant. She turned to Lawrence. Mr. Ansley, do you agree to a DNA test? Lawrence looked as if he had been cornered. He glanced quickly at his attorney, then reluctantly nodded. Good, the judge said. I would now like to call a witness who I believe can shed some light on certain aspects of this case. Mr. Robert Pettigrew, please approach the witness stand. I turned to Delilah in surprise. Robert, Abraham's nephew? She looked equally puzzled. A man in his 50s entered the room, with a marked resemblance to Abraham, the same dark eyes, the same nose shape. He looked a little uncomfortable being the center of attention. After the oath was administered, Judge Huxley began her questioning. Mr. Pettigrew, were you close to your uncle, Abraham Pettigrew? Yes, Your Honor, especially in recent years when I took over the company. Did your uncle discuss with you his decision to leave his personal fortune to Mrs. Hilda Ansley? Robert nodded. Yes, he informed me a few months before he died, said he wanted to secure her future. How did you react to that decision? Robert shrugged his shoulders slightly. To be honest, I wasn't surprised. Uncle Abraham had loved Hilda all his life. He never said so explicitly, but I knew. He had pictures he kept in his study, old ones from when they were young. Sometimes he told stories about her, especially when he was drinking. I felt a lump come up to my throat. Abraham remembered me all these years, thought of me. Did you ever doubt your uncle's capacity at the time of the will? The judge continued. No, never, Robert answered firmly. Uncle Abraham kept his mind clear until his last days. His body failed him, but not his mind. What about Mrs. Ansley? Do you think she might have manipulated your uncle? Robert even smiled slightly. Uncle Abraham was impossible to make him do something he didn't want to do. He was a stubborn man with firm principles, and the way he talked about Hilda, Robert looked at me. He really loved you, Mrs. Ansley, all his life. I couldn't hold back the tears that came to my eyes. Thank you, Mr. Pettigrew, Judge Huxley said. Do you have anything else you would like to tell the court? Robert hesitated a moment. As a matter of fact, yes. After my uncle died, I was approached by Mr. Lawrence Ansley. He nodded towards Lawrence. He was interested not only in the will, but also in the details of the company's management, the structure of its assets. Offered me a deal. There was a low whisper in the courtroom. What kind of deal? The judge asked. He offered to help me contest my uncle's will, said that if I testified that my uncle wasn't himself in the last months of his life, he'd ensure my position in the management of the company, even when he got a controlling interest. Lawrence jumped up from his seat. That's a lie, he shouted. I never said any such thing. Mr. Ansley, Judge Huxley pronounced sternly, sit down at once. Lawrence collapsed in his seat, his face white with rage. Mr. Pettigrew, continued the judge, can you produce any evidence of this conversation? Robert nodded. Yes, Your Honor. I recorded our conversation on a tape recorder. Didn't trust Mr. Ansley from the beginning. He pulled a small device from his pocket and handed it to the judge. Thank you, Judge Huxley said. The court will study this tape. Delilah stood up. Mr. Pettigrew, was Lawrence Ansley the only one who tried to influence your opinion on your uncle's will? Robert shook his head. No, I was also approached by his wife, Verity Ansley. She was more direct, said they were having financial problems and were desperate for money, offered me a percentage of the inheritance in exchange for helping them get it. I looked at Verity. She was sitting with her head down, clearly avoiding her husband's gaze. Judge Huxley called Verity to the witness stand. After the oath was administered, she asked, Mrs. Ansley, do you confirm Mr. Pettigrew's accusations? Verity cast a helpless glance at Lawrence, then lowered her eyes. Yes, Your Honor. Her voice was barely audible. Yeah, we're in serious financial trouble. Lawrence has made some bad investments. We're on the verge of bankruptcy. When we found out about the inheritance that Hilda got, and you thought you were entitled to that money? The judge asked sharply. No, I mean, Verity hesitated. Lawrence said that the money should have gone to us, that Abraham Pettigrew had deceived his mother, taken advantage of her gullibility. And you believed that? Verity shook her head. No, Your Honor. Yeah, I saw how happy Hilda was with Abraham. It didn't seem like cheating. Then why did you agree to participate in this scheme? Because I was afraid, Your Honor. Lawrence, he's not a man who takes rejection or failure lightly. When he found out about the inheritance, he became obsessed with getting the money. Said it was the only way to save our family, our way of life. You lying bitch! Lawrence suddenly screamed. You agreed to it. You proposed the plan. Mr. Inslee! Judge Huxley banged her gavel. I find you guilty of contempt of court. Bailiff, please escort Mr. Inslee to the holding room. He will remain there until the end of the hearing. Two bailiffs approached Lawrence and escorted him out of the room despite his protests. Mrs. Ansley, the judge continued, turning to Verity, do you have anything else you would like to tell the court? Yes, Your Honor. I want to confess that all of the evidence we provided about Hilda's odd behavior was either greatly exaggerated or completely made up. Lawrence had the children write letters about their grandmother's alleged forgetfulness. He instructed me on how to testify. It was all part of the plan to gain control of Hilda's money. I spent the first week after the trial in the silence of my home, pondering everything that had happened. Judge Huxley not only dismissed Lawrence's lawsuit in its entirety, but also placed a 6-month ban on him from approaching me without my consent. I didn't know if I would ever be ready to see him again. The DNA test results came back 2 weeks later, confirming what I already knew. There was no biological kinship between us. Lawrence received a copy of those results. He didn't contact me, perhaps because of the restraining order, or, more likely, because of pride. His world had crumbled that day in court, and knowing his character, I knew he would rather live among the wreckage than reach out for reconciliation. Verity called me a few days after the DNA test results were announced. Lawrence had moved out, she said without preamble. He'd taken his things and moved into an apartment across town. I'm sorry, I replied, not sure if it was true. Don't be. I could hear the relief in her voice. Our marriage had been dead for a long time, but neither of us was willing to admit it. What had happened had only hastened the inevitable. We talked some more. She told me that she was trying to find work, for the first time in 20 years of marriage to Lawrence. About the children, Sebastian was taking the divorce hard, and Audrey seemed to be more accepting. About the fact that they will likely lose the house because of Lawrence's debts. I'm sorry about that, Verity, I said, and this time sincerely. Especially about the kids. We'll get through this, she said, a new firmness in her voice. Maybe it's for the best. For too long I've lived in a golden cage, afraid to take a step outside. Now I have no choice but to learn to fly. At the end of the conversation, Verity asked if the children could visit me. I agreed, though with some misgivings. I didn't know what Lawrence had told them about me, about the trial, about the fact that I wasn't their father's biological mother. Audrey came first, alone, a week after our conversation with Verity. She was 15, that awkward age when you're no longer a child but not yet an adult. She stood on my doorstep, shuffling from foot to foot, her backpack over her shoulder, and an uncertain smile. Hi, Grandma, she said quietly. I hugged her, feeling her shoulders tense. Hi, sweetheart. Come in. We drank tea in the kitchen, and at first we didn't have much of a conversation. Audrey gave me one-word answers, avoiding looking me in the eye. I didn't press her, letting her get used to it. Finally, she asked bluntly, Is it true you're not Daddy's real grandmother? I sighed. Of course, Lawrence had told them everything to my disadvantage. Biologically, no, I answered honestly. But I'd raised him from birth, loved him, cared for him. In every sense except biologically, I was his mother. Audrey nodded thoughtfully. Dad says you've been deceiving him all his life. It's complicated, Audrey. When your daddy was little, your grandfather and I decided it was best not to tell him the truth. Maybe it was the wrong decision, but it seemed right at the time. And then, the more time passed, the harder it became to come clean. I looked at her, so young, but with a glimmer of grown-up wisdom in her eyes. You know, often the biggest mistakes we make are well-intentioned. I didn't mean to hurt your father, but in the end, that's exactly what I did. Audrey was silent for a long time, twirling the cup in her hands. Mom said that Dad wanted to take all your money, that he was trying to prove you were crazy. I nodded. Yeah, that was true. And Mom was helping him? Her voice trembled. Audrey, I chose my words carefully. Adults sometimes make mistakes. Your parents were in financial trouble and saw my inheritance as a way out. That doesn't excuse their actions, but it helps me understand their motives. They made Sebastian and I write letters about your strange behavior. Audrey admitted, tears glistening in her eyes. I didn't want to, but Daddy said it was for your own good, that you needed help. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. I know, honey, it's not your fault, and I'm not mad at you. After that conversation, Audrey started coming regularly, sometimes with Sebastian, though he was always more distant, clearly torn between loyalty to his father and a desire to maintain a relationship with me. I didn't press him, giving him time to decide for himself. There was no word from Lawrence for almost 3 months. Then one day, coming back from a walk, I saw him sitting on a bench in front of my house. He was visibly gaunt, with more gray in his dark hair. When he saw me, he didn't get up, just watched me approach. "Hello, Lawrence," I said, stopping a few paces from the bench. "Hello, Hilda?" He called me by my first name instead of Mom, for the first time in his life. We looked at each other, two strangers bound by decades of shared life. "The restraining order is still in effect," I remarked. "I know. I'm not going to come near your house or bother you. I just wanted to talk, if that's okay with you." I hesitated. Part of me wanted to just walk on by, leave him sitting there alone with all his problems and frustrations. But the other part, the part that raised him, loved him no matter what, couldn't do that. "10 minutes," I said, sitting down on the opposite end of the bench. "What do you want to say?" Lawrence took a deep breath, as if gathering his strength. "I tried to hate you," he said finally, "after the trial, after the DNA test. Tried to convince myself that you ruined my life with your lies, that if you'd told the truth sooner, things might have been different." He stared straight ahead, avoiding my gaze. "But the truth is, I ruined my own life. By my greed, by my selfishness. I've lost my wife. I've been estranged from my children. I've lost my job. All because of money that was never mine." "I'm sorry about that, Lawrence," I said quietly. "I really am." He grinned bitterly. "Do you know what the ironic thing is? If I had just come to you and been honest about my problems, you probably would have helped me, without the courts, without all the messy stuff." "Probably," I agreed. "But we'll never know for sure, will we?" Lawrence turned to me at last. "I'm not apologizing," he said. "And I'm not suggesting we start over. Too much has happened. But I wanted you to know that I realize I was wrong. And I'm grateful for everything you've done for me, for raising me, even though you didn't have to." I looked at him, this man I had once held in my arms as a newborn, whose first steps and first words had been a miracle to me, who was now broken but perhaps for the first time in his life honest with himself. "Thank you for those words, Lawrence," I replied. "They are important to me." We sat in silence for a moment longer, and then he stood up. "I'm leaving Flower Mound," he said. "Got a job in Austin. A fresh start, as they say." I nodded. "Good luck to you." "You too." He paused, as if he wanted to say something else, then just nodded and walked away. I stared after him, feeling a strange mix of emotions, sadness, relief, a quiet sadness for what could have been, but never would be. Perhaps it was better for both of us to separate, to start living our lives without the weight of mutual resentments and expectations. 2 more months passed after that meeting. Spring was early that year, and by the beginning of April, the garden around my house was already covered with the first flowers. I spent a lot of time on the open porch I had added to the house, one of the first things I had acquired after Abraham's inheritance. Verity had found a job at the local library, not the highest paying position, but stable. She and the kids moved into a small apartment not far from my house. Sebastian and Audrey often stopped by after school. Gradually, even Sebastian thawed, especially when I helped him with a history project that got him a top grade. I haven't forgiven Verity completely. Some things are impossible to forget. But I've learned to accept her new role in my grandchildren's lives and, by extension, in my own life. I handled Abraham's money carefully. I left most of it under Mr. Holt's management, but set aside a certain amount for special projects. The first was an education fund for Audrey and Sebastian, the money they would receive when they reached adulthood to pay for college or start their own businesses. The second project was the renovation of my house, not luxurious but thorough. New roof, new plumbing, fresh paint on the walls. The house that for years had been just a place where I lived, saving on everything to provide for Lawrence, was finally truly mine. Cozy, bright, the way I'd always wanted it. And the third and most important project. I started traveling. Not luxury tours, but simple, thoughtful travel. First was London, the city I had dreamed of since childhood. Then Paris, Rome, Barcelona. I traveled alone, but I never felt lonely. I met interesting people, made some good travel buddies. I kept a diary, took photos, sent postcards to my grandchildren. After each trip, I returned home with new impressions, new ideas, new energy. My home no longer seemed empty. It was filled with memories and plans for the future. One warm May evening, sitting on the veranda and watching the sunset, I was going through old photos. Among them was the one I had found in the garage over a year ago. Abraham and me, young, smiling, looking through the lens with hope and joy. Next to it lay a photo taken shortly before he died. Us in the same spot, in Flower Mound City Park, only now with wrinkles on our faces, gray in our hair, but the same light in our eyes. I thought about all the decisions that had brought me to this moment, about choosing Edgar over Abraham when I was young, about the decision to take someone else's child and raise it as my own, about years of saving and self-denial for Lawrence, of decades of silence and secrecy. Was there another way? Of course there was. There are always other paths, other decisions, other lives we could have lived. But that night, watching the sunset over Flower Mound, I felt no regret for the first time in a long time. I had done what I thought was right at every moment of my life, with the understanding and the opportunities I had. And now, at 74, I was finally free from the sense of duty that had hung over me all my life, from the guilt of the lies I had hidden for so long, from having to justify and apologize for wanting to live my life. I looked up to the sky, where the first stars were appearing, and mentally thanked Abraham, not only for the inheritance that had given me financial independence, but also for the love that had, however briefly, brought me back to life, for the fact that he saw in me not only a mother, not only an accountant, not only a victim of circumstances, but a woman with her own desires, hopes, and dreams. The next day, I went to a travel agency and booked tickets to Japan, a country Abraham and I had often talked about, but which he had never gotten to see. I'll go there in the fall, when the maples are red and the mountains are a light haze. I'll see everything for both of us, feel everything for both of us. In the meantime, I had a veranda to drink tea and read books on, a garden to grow flowers and vegetables, grandchildren who come over with stories about school and friends, neighbors to have a word with over the fence, friends to meet over lunch or a game of bridge. I had a life, my own life finally, and I was savoring every moment of it. The phone rang, interrupting my musings. It was Audrey asking if she could come over with a friend to bake cookies in my kitchen. They were doing some kind of school project. Of course, dear, I replied with a smile. Come on over. I was just about to make some fresh tea. I hung up the phone and got up to prepare the kitchen for the girls' arrival. Life went on, and it was a good life.